The problem with the national debt is trying to rack it up to figure out exactly what the deficit is from year to year. Remember, the deficit is the annual amount we're falling short, and the debt is the amount that every year accumulates. That's the difference between the debt and the deficit. And like Mrs. Clinton would say, well, remember when President Clinton left office, we had a balanced budget. Horse feathers, you did. That budget was balanced simply by the fact that certain things were moved off budget and certain things were anticipated on an accrual basis, assuming that certain things would happen in the next 5 to 10 years, which, surprise, they didn't. Okay. The way you tell whether or not we had a balanced budget, the U.S. debt went up every single year of the Clinton administration, just like it has done under President Bush's administration. That's the real indicator as to whether or not we have a balanced budget or not. So I don't have the other figures for the GDP and everything in my head. An answer?
Yep.
Okay. Good.
Ron Paul is accused of being an isolationist in some of these so-called debates. What do they mean? What is your opinion on it?
Well, it depends on what you mean by isolation. The isolationism of a century ago isn't possible anymore. It's just not. Because we're interdependent. I hate to use a term like that. Like it shivers because that's a globalist term, interdependence. But to a certain degree we are. We are one world. And we do have to trade with other people. I think what Ron Paul is saying is if we would get our noses out of everybody else's business, maybe they wouldn't be so mad at us. And we wouldn't have as many problems. Now, of course, people like Rudy Giuliani sneered at Ron Paul when he talked about 9/11 being a result of some of our meddling in the Middle East. But you have to look at it from the eyes of the people in the Middle East. Ever since 1917, when General Allenby entered Jerusalem and the Ottoman Turks lost the majority of the Middle East territory we're now talking about today, Iran, Iraq, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, the great powers of the world, France, the UK, and the United States, began meddling in the Middle East. Now, for the Muslim world, which was supposed to see Islam conquer the world, remember, for the first 4 centuries, they made terrific progress. They swept all around the Mediterranean basin, up through the Iberian Peninsula, up through the Balkans. This was seen as something of a bad thing. So our meddling, and our CIA does do nasty things to people, and we do meddle in elections. And so that's Ron Paul's position. He's right about that. Whether we can isolate ourselves totally, I don't think it's going to happen anymore. We are just too interdependent. We can't manufacture anything here in this country right now. You realize World War II, say for example, why were we able to, between December 7, 1941 and about 1943, how was it we were able to come up to speed with war material so fast? It's because we had an entire infrastructure in place. All we had to do was retool the car factories and everything else to make war implements. We couldn't do that today. We have a rotted out infrastructure in this country. It's why bridges are collapsing. It's why semis are going into potholes, It's because all of that money has been siphoned off, all of the highway taxes you pay at the pump. So next time somebody tells you about the big evil oil companies, the biggest profiteers at the pump are local, state, and federal governments. They make more profit on a gallon of gas than the oil companies who take all the risk. It's a real rat's nest risk world out there for oil companies. U.S. oil companies are only 15% of the game now in the whole oil market. It's a wild card right now. So.
This question is from a young person who talks about Germany in 1939, and one of the few differences would be the date. If history is repeating itself, what do we do now before the camps are set up, before we have to show papers, and what do we do now?
Well, since we're not there, the best thing you can do is, Germany didn't see it coming. Right? That's the most interesting thing about Germany. Most Germans didn't see it coming. They thought Adolf Hitler was a good guy. And if you go back to that era, read materials from Germany from that era, I used to do a show on this, how Germany went and converted. I'll do a whole hour presentation. And I'll put up PowerPoint or slides of campaign posters from that time. Because Germany was being threatened by the Bolsheviks. They saw a threat. And so the best defense against the threat were the National Socialists, which were on the right side. Remember, okay, contrary to people, it's not, I'll use your frame of reference, the left over here is radical socialism or Marxism, the right over here is fascism. That's how people would like you to look at it. I say, look at it this way. Make a circle and take that thing and bend it around like this. Okay? Freedom is at the top, and you have to work at it to preserve it. If you slide around the left part of the circle through socialism and Marxism, you wind up at the bottom. If you slide around the right side of the circle through fascism, you wind up at the bottom. When you get to the bottom, it looks the same, no matter which side of the circle you have come around. And remember, a Marxist is simply a socialist in a hurry with a Kalashnikov. That's the only difference. Other than that, they're essentially the same. So did we answer that? The most important thing you can do is talk to people now. Okay, you know what the one killer in Germany was? What killed the church? What killed the Jews in Germany was denial. You know, they constantly kept hunkering down at every point, hoping that it would get better. You know, well, hey, that's not so bad. We should hunker down. If you hunker down, you know, he's not going to do that stuff to the Jews. You know, he won't do that. Denial was the big factor that people didn't believe was true. Even today, what are people doing? You know, I can even think of certain national talk show hosts, if you talk about the Security and Prosperity Party, they go ballistic. But have you ever checked it out? Well, no, but I'm going ballistic, you know. Talking to people, here's where we are, here's where we're going to go. That's what I forgot.
Do you think there's a prospect of the American empire, the United States, splitting up relatively peacefully as the former USSR did?
I don't know. Well, we don't have an empire like the USSR did. Remember, the USSR incorporated a huge number of stands in other countries, correct? So they fell apart, Putin sort of put them back together in a new Russia. Our empire is becoming different in that we're being merged into a bigger system. So I'm not sure how to answer that question. You know, I'm not sure. Beware of the word imperialism. Okay, imperialism was introduced into the American vocabulary by a really hardcore leftist Marxist sympathizer during the 60s. It's a Marxist term used against the West. So anytime people start talking about imperialism, do you know where that came from? You understand that the purpose of it was to sow dissent inside the United States and everything else. On the other hand, you know, every empire sort of collapsed, but it collapses from within. It collapses from its own rot and largely from its own monetary implosion, which is Ron Paul is right. Like a country is strong with a strong currency, it's weak. I have at home a denarius, a silver denarius minted in 44 BC. And it was pure silver. By 200 AD, they were just totally base metal. The emperors in Rome had totally debased the metal. And I always keep that coin around just to remember that this happens. Every single fiat currency in the history of the world has always been destroyed to the point that it fell apart. And typically during that time of destruction, when it comes, countries go to war. Because their populace are going through such pain and having lost all of their assets and their values that governments need to turn the attitudes of their populace to something different. It's why the Falklands War started, or as the Argentines would say, Las Islas Malvinas, because the triumvirate government there being run, it was a military junta, not junta, like these people keep wanting to say. It comes from the word, the Spanish word, juntarse, which means to join together. Okay, it's not a junta like Dan Rather would say. Crazy. They were in trouble because of their currency. They've been inflating it. They were having all the same problems Ron Paul's talking about. So they said, you know, let's go get those Falklands back from the British. That's what started the Falklands War. Because governments need to distract from what their problem is. Anything else? Any live questions? Yes, sir.
Have you seen, I just would be give your comment on something. You know, normally when the Federal Reserve is monetizing debt,
right.
You know, their debt balances go up on their balance sheet. The last 6 months, even though you expect they're printing more money, the amount of Federal Reserve notes that the Treasury bills that they hold has gone down about $50 billion over 6 months.
Right.
Can you
well, number one, if you notice, we can't see the M3 money supply anymore. Okay, you know why we stopped printing the M3 money, the M3. Although John, who is it at Shadow Government Statistics? John Williams, thank you. John Williams at Shadow Government Statistics is replicating it. That is because they have other instruments and other ways they can route that money around. There's almost an infinite way of that you can, when that money is created, where it can be, how it can be routed, what instruments it shows up in, and what bubbles it creates.